Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to tell the story of the Russian Revolution as it moves through the Russian Civil War and eventually the founding of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So we're going to pick up that thread as far as one of the main effects of World War I. So here's our objectives for today. Let's dive in and talk about the rise of communism in Russia. So, as you hopefully remember, when the Tsar was overthrown and the Bolsheviks seized control of Petrograd, they negotiated a separate peace with the Germans and, for the most part, seized control of the Tsarist governmental apparatuses. But that does not mean that they won control over all the hearts and minds of the Russians. In the end, the Bolsheviks were one minority party amongst a bunch of other socialist groups, not to mention the Tsarist groups, the military, a lot of the foreign ethnic groups in Russia. And so, for the Bolsheviks to actually consolidate control over a country as large as Russia, they were going to have to suppress all of those other groups in what's called the Russian Civil War. And the Russian Civil War is an incredibly complicated, sort of multifaceted conflict. And so we're not going to get into all of the details here. We're going to oversimplify, but also try to explain the various forces involved and eventually why the Red Army was victorious. The communist forces were known as the Red Army. They started out as mostly simply the Red Guards, the group of dedicated Bolsheviks that had seized control of Petrograd. After the whole overthrow of the Kerensky government, as they were trying to sort of protect this provisional government from rogue generals and things like that after the Kornilov affair. And so it started out as that, but eventually it evolved into a pretty effective fighting force because they were pretty dedicated, at least for the most part, to the communist cause, and they had something clear that they were fighting for. They also sort of controlled a lot of the population centers of Russia, at least Petrograd and then eventually Moscow, which they would move to and become the capital, especially as, the end of World War I, Germany was threatening Petrograd. And so it made sense for the Bolsheviks to move the capital somewhere further away from the front lines in order to protect their new government from German aggression. Communists, in the aftermath of the war, issued this decree about the socialist fatherland being in danger. And so the People's Commissars are going to seize control of all government. And I'll just let you read the rest of this and then we'll come back together. Obviously, the food requisitions is pretty important and pretty controversial. Mobilizing all the workers and peasants, because of course these are the groups that the communists pledged to support, is pretty important here. And if they could actually pull this off, it's kind of a levée en masse for the communists. But in reality, a lot of people are going to ignore this. And so the Russian people are never going to rise to the Bolsheviks' aid to the extent that they wanted. And as you remember from the French Revolution, various French groups also resisted the French revolutionaries. And so none of that was necessarily, determinative. Leon Trotsky is the guy who was most responsible for developing war communism. War communism more or less throws all the principles of communism out in order to create a powerful central bureaucracy in order to win the war. So, communism is based on theoretically equality and individual rights. It's also based on collective ownership of things, but we're going to throw a lot of that out and centralize power in order to give the Red Army the strength it needs in order to fight its enemies. And so war communism means setting aside a lot of the principles of socialism in favor of dictatorship and centralized power, which Trotsky felt was necessary to win the war, and which did build the Red Army into a pretty formidable fighting force under Trotsky. The White Armies, on the other hand, are a whole hodgepodge of different groups of people. The White Russians, despite the fact that the communists tried to portray them as pawns of the capitalists of the French, British, and Americans, in reality, there were a whole bunch of different groups. I mean, some of them were legitimate Russian nationalists fighting for the Tsar. Some of them were opportunists who were more loyal to their commanders than any sort of broad sense of communism. Some of them were ethnic nationalists, Polish people, Ukrainian people, Finnish people, who wanted to, break away from the Russian Empire and wanted self-determination for themselves. And so because of this, what you're never going to see is sort of a unified white army fighting all on one front and for the same purpose. Instead, there's a whole bunch of different white armies fighting for a whole bunch of different purposes, which of course is going to make it really hard to win a civil war because although the communists were centrally controlled and united, the whites were all the heck over the place and fighting for a whole bunch of different things, which may or may not have been, consistent and compatible. The other problem the White armies had is that their tactics were generally pretty brutal. Alexander Kolchak was one of the generals of the White Army that was sort of in the eastern part of the country. He's going to try to seize control of the country, declare himself dictator, and destroy Bolshevism. He's going to order the mass destruction of any villages who don't support them, and the use of terror tactics and, collective punishment against anyone who pushes back against the White Army's advances. So even people who weren't totally thrilled with the Reds, with war communism, with the abandoning of communist ideals, with forced grain requisitions, forced conscription, all that stuff. I mean, the Reds were doing a lot of things to alienate the Russian people. The Whites were, if it's possible, doing even worse stuff. And so for the Russian people, they had to choose between the communists, who they didn't love, and the whites, who they really didn't love. And so rather than being seen as liberators, the White Army came in and was usually viewed as conquerors, as bad as the communists. And the result of that is they had limited popular support. The even larger problem is the revolt of the Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechoslovak Legion was a group of Czechoslovakians who were some of Russia's, most efficient troops. After Russia withdrew from World War I, they still wanted to fight the Germans in order to try to push for Czechoslovak independence. And so they got on trains and headed out to Vladivostok so they could get on boats and theoretically go to the Western Front and keep fighting. But about halfway across, the communists had seized control of everything, and the Czechoslovak Legion just stopped and seized control of the rail line in order to force their way home because they were worried that they were going to get conscripted into one of these armies. And so the result of this is rail travel throughout Russia totally stopped. The White armies lost any ability to coordinate with each other. And all of a sudden, you've got these Czechoslovakians controlling all the central railways in Russia, which means that if the White armies were going to try to unite together, it was totally impossible to do so because rail travel in Russia ground to a halt. And this gave the communists significantly more time to organize in the Russian heartland and to prepare themselves for the eventual assaults of what could have been overwhelming white forces. Because again, the Bolsheviks were a minority group in Russia who, if the White armies had worked together, they could have easily crushed the Bolsheviks and swept them out. In fact, just like the early phases of the French Revolution, most of the rest of the world thought the Bolsheviks were going to be a flash in the pan. We're going to seize control of these cities and then quickly be swept away. But the paralyzing of rail travel in Russia made that almost impossible. And when the White Army launched their offensives, they launched them at different times. And so we saw first Kolchak's army coming in from the eastern parts of Russia, which Trotsky's able to turn and sort of blunt. And then Denikin launches his attack from the south, from the Crimean area. After this, trying to push to Moscow, but then Trotsky's able to turn and blunt his offensive. And then the offense from the north comes, but much later. And so because these three offensives are not coordinated at all, Trotsky is able to use the Red Army to repel each one of them in turn. And then the White Army is really going to lose steam. Without any territory to take, without any real hope of success, these White Armies sort of melt away, leaving the communists as the only ones left. And so almost by a combination of accident, circumstance, and honestly, pretty effective planning by Trotsky, the Red Army is going to be victorious, the Whites are going to melt away, and the communists are going to seize control of Russia, which was seemed almost impossible in 1918 when the revolution looked like it was going to be crushed by overwhelming white forces. The communists, or the Bolsheviks, then declared the creation of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the other territories that they'd taken. And admittedly, there's a lot of history I'm glossing over here. The fight for Ukraine, the fight for Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, the Kazakhs, all of these areas. These could have been episodes all on their own if this was Russian history. So if you're interested in all those stories, take a moment and go pause and go out and talk about those, because I'm going to gloss over their incorporation into the USSR, but there's tons of tiny little dramas in all of those places. The creation of this central state of the USSR, the Supreme Soviet, is theoretically supposed to be the bureaucracy controlling the USSR. Then there's layers of commissars under that, and there's layers of commissars under that. Each ethnic group is supposed to have their own commissars. There's this Supreme Court. There's all of this bureaucracy. But as with almost all communist countries, all of this is mostly window dressing for the fact that the leading council of the Bolsheviks, the Supreme Council of the Communist Party, is going to control all of this. Even if Lenin isn't the specific head of state of Russia, because he controls the Communist Party, he's going to control all these different apparatuses, and all of this stuff is mostly irrelevant. And so one of the secrets about most communist countries is there is significant government bureaucracy, but there's also this weird informal power structure within the party that determines what decisions are actually made. And so it can be very hard from an outsider or someone just looking at this to see where power lies. But just trust me, power lies with Lenin. It lies with whoever controls the Communist Party. Whoever controls the Communist Party is the one who's able to determine how all of this stuff is given out. And early on, you can clearly see that Communist Party members live better than non-party members. And so for most people in Russia, being part of the Communist Party was absolutely essential to having a good life and was also the path to political power. There's all these other posts, but who's in those posts and what those people do is controlled by the Communist Party, as well as, honestly, who gets to eat, who gets a nice apartment in Moscow, in the Kremlin, who gets, all of this stuff. It's determined by your membership in the party and your standing with the party leadership. Unfortunately for Russia, their economy collapses right after this. There's a spectacular famine pretty early on. There's really, the combination of World War I and the Civil War leads to just disastrous grain harvests. And the fact that you're nationalizing all this land is going to lead peasants to not put in a lot of extra effort. And so there's a great famine in 1921 that leads to a spectacular death toll. Lenin, in order to try to spur on production, brings in the new economic policy. It's a temporary return to capitalism to create more incentives in order to alleviate the famine. Peasants can sell surplus grain, so all of a sudden they start creating surplus grain. It turns out when the Red Army is coming through and confiscating all your surplus grain, you don't have any incentive to produce surplus grain. Small factories are going to be re-privatized because it turns out when you're working in a state-owned factory and you're paid regardless of what you produce, there's not tons of incentives to produce. And so building back in capitalist incentives helps to increase the production of the Soviet Union and puts them back on this path to potential prosperity, with the goal being that socialism is eventually going to be around the corner and this is not going to be a permanent policy. Fortunately or unfortunately, we never get to see the true effects of the new economic policy. Despite the propaganda, it's never really given the chance to fully work because Lenin is going to die suddenly in 1924. With Lenin dead, there's no real successor to him. There was no plan for him for someone else to take over, and so it leads to a power struggle within the Russian Communist Party between Joseph Stalin and Trotsky to some extent. Although, honestly, Stalin has already started to take a lead in this by consolidating control within the Communist Party, or starting to consolidate control within the Communist Party. We have this document from Lenin's last testament, which is revealed after his death, which may or may not have been falsified, where he basically condemns both Stalin and Trotsky. You should pause and definitely read it, arguing that they're both dangerous in different ways. And in the end, Stalin is the guy who's going to win in this. He's going to isolate Trotsky, expel him from the Communist Party, kicking him out of leadership. He's going to replace him as head of the Red Army. And he does this very gradually through a policy called Dosage. Basically, they start holding informal meetings and stop inviting Trotsky. Then he starts to do this to other leaders. He starts isolating other leaders or anyone else who opposes him. And these informal meetings that Stalin is holding become the place where decisions are made. And if you're not invited to Stalin's dacha or his special meetings or his vacation house or wherever, you're finding yourself isolated and locked out of power. And then eventually, once you have no friends left, Stalin can move against you, expel you from the party, and you have a choice between more or less starving or attempting to flee. Stalin then starts rewriting Russian history to make himself sort of the central figure in all of this, to raise up his role in the Russian Revolution, to show him as an absolute leader of the Russian Communist Party, and to really create this propaganda to make a cult of personality around him, to help build adoration from the Russian people. And so he starts building a totalitarian state around himself. And we'll talk more about this when we get to totalitarianism in World War II. But we can see this happening in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He also significantly increases the power of the secret police, the Cheka, and makes sure that they are absolutely loyal to him and that they are a party loyalist or a Stalin loyalist, more importantly, is in charge of them. They will eventually, of course, be reorganized into the incredibly brutal NKVD. And then Stalin starts to purge other enemies of the party. Stalin is also going to bring in this idea of 5-year plans. Like centrally planned economic programs which focus on specific elements of the economy, building up the agricultural sector or building up steel production or things like that. This type of central planning sends specific quotas for various industries to hit, with substantial punishments if they don't hit them. Here's Stalin's speech laying out why he thinks this is necessary, which again is pretty straightforward. And then he's going to push collectivization of agriculture, which had never really been completed. As we remember before, Lenin's new economic plan had allowed peasants to keep surplus grain. Stalin is going to move away from that. And as you can see here, Voroshilov was again noticing that the peasants weren't motivated to work. Well, Stalin's going to come up with a way to force them to work. Basically, they're going to work or they're going to starve. And so what we get is organized famine in Ukraine. They're going to seize crops and move them away and kill somewhere in the area of, and again, numbers are somewhat sketchy here, 6 million people in a forced famine in order to force peasants into collectivization against their will. Eventually, this is going to lead to substantially increased agricultural yields because, no one wants to die. And then Stalin is going to use this and use the assassination of a high-ranking Russian official named Kirov to purge the party of anyone not loyal to him. So once Kirov is dead, Stalin's secret police and his secret police chief Orlov is going to purge the rest of the party of all non-Stalin loyalists. Stalin is going to be a big fan of show trials, basically torturing people until they show up and say the lines that he wants. They're going to admit to a whole host of different crimes before they are executed. And this Great Purge is going to really destroy the top echelon of Soviet government and the Soviet military and leave behind it nothing but Stalin loyalists. Here's the period of Stalin's terror. You see various waves of this red terror as Stalin consolidates power. So pause and read this. And then eventually he's going to eliminate Orlov and anyone else who opposes him, making himself really the influential man, the only figure left who stands at the top of the Soviet hierarchy. And so he and his inner circle are going to control everything. And if anyone displeases him even in the slightest, he starts locking him out of meetings. And of course, that brings them back in line because no one wants to get caught up in the next of Stalin's purges. Stalin is also going to send all his political enemies to this Gulag Archipelago, this series of prison camps created throughout the USSR. Stalin is going to send millions of people to these prison camps during his short 20 years in power. And so the creation of these vast prison camps only increases Stalin's central power and allows him to simply make people disappear. People who oppose Stalin or who go against the regime are shipped off to these labor camps where they work until they die. So that is Stalin's rise to power in the USSR and the growth of the USSR as a powerful state. We'll come back to the USSR, of course, once it gets involved in the Second World War. But for now, we'll leave it here as the last sort of effect of World War I. We've now got a communist country kind of under the rule of Joseph Stalin. So thank you for listening.